During the 2015 Republican primary election, the neurosurgeon Ben Carson was asked if he thought that a Muslim should be president of the United States, and he said no, and this caused a bit of controversy, and Senator Ted Cruz was asked the same question. Now, Cruz, being a good constitutionalist, he said, of course a Muslim could be president. There should be no religious test for high office. But then an interesting thing happened. One of the audience members asked, well, what about an atheist? And at that point, the Constitution goes out the window, and Cruz says, no.
Any president who doesn't begin every day on his knees isn't fit to be commander-in-chief of this country.
Amen.
It's sort of an odd phrasing, but it turns out that a large percentage of the country actually agrees with Cruz. Gallup's been keeping these polls for 60 years now about whether you're willing to vote for members of various groups to be president. And just until recently, over half the country said they wouldn't vote for even a qualified member of their own party if that person was an atheist. Now, why is that the case? So in the last few lectures, we talked about how religion serves as a cue of trust. Believers will see other believers as trustworthy people because they recognize that the other believer will not only hold a divinely inspired code of morality, but they'll also fear the punishment of God should they violate that morality. Now, if that's the case, the flip side of that should be that atheists should be not only not enjoying that level of trust, but they should also be targets of distrust. Now, a little while ago, I interviewed my colleague Will Gervais, who's led some of the research on this. Let's go to that interview now.
I think a lot of the antipathy directed towards atheists, as you mentioned, it's not just a general dislike. Instead, it really boils down to a moral distrust that itself is a product of people's intuitions about what morality is and where it comes from. You look at some large-scale polls, for instance, in the US, around 55% of people will say that morality actually requires belief in God.
You cannot be moral without being
cannot be moral if you do not believe in God. That sounds like a shockingly high number, but the US isn't at all an outlier on that. If you look worldwide, it's only in, say, Western Europe where you'll see most people typically disagreeing with that statement. So that leads to kind of one strong possibility, which is that if people are saying religion is what enables morality, then it would follow that people who aren't religious and who don't believe in God just must be morally suspicious characters. They're wild cards. You can get up to anything.
So Gervais and I have done several studies on this, looking at both the implicit distrust of atheists as well as the more self-reported explicit distrust of atheists. In one of these studies, we looked at something based on this psychological phenomenon called the representativeness heuristic. Now, there's a classic way of demonstrating the representativeness heuristic, which is that you give people this scenario of Linda being a 31-year-old in college. She was very involved in social justice issues and anti-nuclear demonstrations, and she's single. And then you ask the question, is Linda more likely to be a bank teller, or is she more likely to be a feminist bank teller? Now, 80% of the people who do this task will select the second one, even though it's statistically impossible that she could be more likely to be part of a subset of all bank tellers than she could just in the superset of bank tellers. The issue is that people think Linda fits the description of a feminist so well, she's so representative of that particular category, that they make the mistake of thinking, well, it must just be so likely that she's a feminist, and so I'm going to choose that statistically impossible choice. So we use that same task by, instead of having Linda, we gave a description of another man who engaged in various immoral activities, and then we asked people in different groups, is Richard more likely to be a teacher or a teacher and a Christian? In another group, they had teacher or teacher and a Muslim. In another, we had teacher or teacher and an atheist. And then in the last category, we tried to think of the most untrustworthy person that we could possibly think of. And we said, is Richard more likely to be a teacher or a teacher and a rapist? And we wanted to see how many people would make the error, the conjunction fallacy error is what it's called, make the representativeness heuristic error and choose that second option in the various groups. And what we found was that people are very unlikely to make the error in the case when it's a teacher and a Christian, and they're slightly more likely, but still not that likely to make the case when it's a teacher and a Muslim. But in the last two cases, the rates jumped up to about 50% of the sample in both cases. There was no statistical difference between those two cases. And so people were very likely to make the representativeness heuristic of an immoral person when it described an atheist, because they see atheists as people who are immoral people. In another one of these studies, we wanted to look specifically at the aspect of trust. How much was trust involved? And if you remove the issue of trust, did people's antipathy towards atheists still remain? So we had people make decisions about whether they'd like to hire a believer or a non-believer for two different professions. One of these professions was a low trust profession. This was a waiter, a profession where you don't really need the person to be the most morally upstanding person. But the other was a high trust situation. This was a daycare worker. And there, because they're interacting with children, you really want to be able to trust that person's a moral exemplar. Now, in that second case, in the high trust situation, you got what you'd expect, what we'd expect from everything we've talked about so far. People were much more inclined to hire the believer than the non-believer. But when you look at the low trust situation, you see that that pattern disappears. In fact, the results sort of tilted the other way, that people slightly preferred to have the atheist as their waiter. What this shows is that when trust is not at stake, prejudice towards atheists disappears. And you can see why people would be so reticent to vote for an atheist president, the presidency being the ultimate high trust job. Granted, the president is constrained by the Constitution and by governmental checks and balances. Nonetheless, he or she is the most powerful person in the country and possibly in the world. And though there are a lot of people who are answerable to the president, people want the president to be answerable to some higher authority, him or herself. After all, we do get them to swear on the Bible. Now, this discussion leaves open several questions. Here are three of them. 1, do atheists distrust other atheists? 2, are atheists actually less trustworthy than religious believers? And 3, can a society still work if the majority of its population are non-believers? These questions turn out not to have simple answers, but let's tackle each of them in turn. So the first question, do atheists distrust other atheists? And the data are actually mixed on this. It seems like that you find different answers if you ask it implicitly versus explicitly. Atheists share some of the same implicit associations between piousness and goodness and atheism and badness as religious believers do. And when you test them on these implicit measures, you'll see that they appear to implicitly distrust atheists as well. If you look on the other end at explicit measures, you find that atheists don't distrust atheists, but they don't show a trust preference for atheists either. Recall the experiment that we talked about earlier, where you had people choosing between the religious believer versus a religious non-believer for their daycare worker. Now, if you split this by the believing subjects versus the non-believing subjects, among the believing subjects, you find exactly what you'd expect, which is that almost everybody chooses the believer as their daycare worker. But if you look at the atheist subjects, you find that they're about evenly split. You don't see the inverse pattern where people are choosing members of their own atheist group to be their daycare worker. It seems instead that people just don't use the religious belief or disbelief as a relevant cue of trust when determining that decision. What that suggests is that you're not seeing the same sort of in-group, out-group dynamic as you see in typical what's called social identity theory with this theist versus atheist dynamic. Instead of being about the group, it seems really to be about the effects of that particular religious belief. Now, for atheists, they don't tend to see themselves as a group with other atheists. Ricky Gervais has this funny line, atheism is a belief system like not playing golf is a hobby. Atheists don't seem to base their group identity on their lack of belief. Now, you might see that change now that communities are springing up based on a common value of atheism. So you see some of these online, you see some of these actually non-religious atheist-based churches. Now that they're basing their community around that idea, you should see those typical psychological group dynamics spring up. But by and large, it's safe to say that most atheists don't hold atheism as a group identity. Question 2, are atheists actually less trustworthy than theists? This turns out to be a surprisingly difficult question to answer for a whole bunch of reasons. One is that when you look at trustworthiness or you look at measures of morality, there are a number of different things that we could look at. You could look on the extreme end at criminality, you could look at something like charity, you could look at something like cheating behavior, you could look at the artificial laboratory tasks that psychologists use to operationalize and strip down moral behavior to its studs. When you do this, you tend to get different results. So when you look at people's self-report measures, you find that religious people do report giving more to charity than do non-religious people. And that's true not just for religious charities, but also for secular charities. But when you measure these things in the lab using some of the economic games that we talked about, you rarely see any difference between theists and atheists emerge. The reason that this data gets very complicated is because it's hard to say whether the experimental tasks we're using in the lab are representative of what's going on in the real world. And it's also hard to say whether people's self-reports in terms of charity are actually accurate representations of what they're giving. Add in the factor that theists and atheists differ on any number of other demographic variables, such as age, gender, socioeconomic status, the question becomes even more complicated. So this is a question that, unfortunately, despite a lot of effort, we don't have a clear answer to yet. Question 3, can societies function if the majority of the population are atheists? Moreover, can you build functional societies without religion, and might those societies actually work better? Well, it turns out that's a very big question. We're going to leave it until we deal with it head on in Module 6. But first, we're going to talk about religious ritual. For that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Slingerland for Module 4.